So you can hear me well now?
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect. How you doing, man?
I'm good. How about you?
Great. Just getting the day started here in Phuket. So got the coffee
Oh,
down.
awesome.
Should be awake any moment.
Yeah, I've been to Phuket a long time ago.
Oh, it's a great place, man. Been here for about 6 months now, and I'm gonna head home for a few months to help my family with their business for a little while. But my girlfriend's here, so yeah, I absolutely love it here.
Awesome. Where's
Um,
where's home?
Newfoundland, Canada.
Oh, awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
What about you in NYC?
Yeah, a little ways outside,
Cool.
but that general area.
Yeah. Well, listen, man. I'm not sure how much time do you have today or tonight.
I got time. I got my daughter, but I think she's asleep. So, but other than that, I'm good. I'm good to go until until I gotta go to sleep at some point. But yeah, I
Sure,
got
sure.
time.
All right, sweet. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this. Like we chatted briefly on Twitter, I have been following you for a while, and Twitter is one of those funny things. You just kind of start to get an idea for a person based on obviously the things that they say, and for a while now, I've been wanting to reach out to you and have a chat. It just I've been pretty busy speaking to a lot of other people recently, and finally, the other day, I had the impetus to put this together. But the first thing I want to ask you is, last couple of days you've been tweeting out just seemingly random numbers. What's the story behind the number tweets?
Yeah, so I was trying to tweet out the number of blocks we had until we hit 6,000.
Ah, okay.
That was that I got I got kind of as I was going through it, I realized like this nobody knows what I'm doing. This is just weird and boring and esoteric. But yeah, that was the idea.
Right, right. Okay, well, why don't we start at the start? Why don't you tell me just how you got into Bitcoin and a little bit about your story, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was working at JP Morgan back in 2016. I had come in through their Veterans Integration Program. My background's in the military. I'm sure we'll talk a bit about that. And I was just looking around, trying to understand the bank, trying to figure out where to go and talk to. You get a bunch of meetings, talk to a bunch of different people, and I ended up, had heard of Bitcoin. Blockchain was like the buzzword at the time, and I met the woman who was running the blockchain team there, and Amber Balde. She's still in the industry. I think she's doing a project Clover, but all of a sudden I realized like she was not anything like anyone else who I was meeting with, who I was talking to the bank. Tattoos, purple hair, the whole thing, like not what you expect. So I got to know her, and you know, you could definitely tell that she was extremely excited about the open source side of all the stuff that was happening. The blockchain thing, enterprise blockchain thing was like, I felt like for her, probably shouldn't speak for her, but like I felt like for that team, like they were really focused on the open source thing and bringing the bank like as close as possible through enterprise blockchain to the actual like revolution that was happening on the open source side. So my transition was basically, getting to know her, doing a bit of work for her and her team. And then just realizing that the job of like trying to steer a massive financial institution like JP Morgan, especially when the CEO is out there saying whatever he was saying during the bubble, that was like a problem that I hope someone tries to solve. Like the guys at Fidelity are doing that, but not something that I was super interested in. So yeah, so then I jumped over. I went to a startup. I worked with Ryan Selkis. I was the first employee at Masari. Really enjoyed that role, but the more I kind of got to understand the industry, the more I felt like there was just a lot of cool experiments out there, but there was one asset that had value. There was one asset that was actually, actually investable, that actually like was delivering on the promises that it made, and it was able to deliver on those by making as few of them as possible, and just by having those extremely strong assurances based on like a really kind of low standard of trust. And at that point, I got into a lot of the reading. I was going to some meetups, and I just realized that Bitcoin was like the most exciting thing happening, the biggest part of this revolution, the most likely to actually move the ball on the things that everyone is talking about and pretends to be caring about. So it just made sense for me to kind of focus all my time and energy in that direction.
Was that a particular moment, or did that just kind of evolve over time? Because I think that's probably happening to more and more people over the last year, where there was all this hype around ICOs and other projects, and then for various reasons, people end up coming back to Bitcoin and thinking like, this is the game. This is the one I want to focus on.
You know what it was, and I've never been like a programmer or anything like that, but I consider myself fairly technical for someone who doesn't have, that background. And I figured, hey, you know what? I'm just going to try to learn this. I'm going to try to understand what's going on. And Bitcoin seems like by far the easiest thing to do. And so I took Jimmy Song's programming blockchain course, and it was just eye opening. I mean, it was like drinking from a fire hose, first of all, and I could barely hang on, but I could hang on, and I could understand that like it's a fairly simple system at like the deepest, most fundamental layer. And then as I kind of got into it and tried to understand some of the other things that are going on in altcoin land, it was just so far beyond me. And I realized that it's also going to be so far beyond almost everyone else. And that's really going to hurt its adoption. It's going to hurt its ability to scale. It's going to, there's so many different trade-offs that go into these complex technical systems. And it made sense to me that something that I could understand was really like the thing that was going to most likely have the longest value over long term, because like, when you're talking about money, people need to be able to kind of understand it, understand how it works, or at least trust that someone else does.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, part of the shift in thinking perhaps is that more and more people are realizing how big of a deal it is that we may, and I think a lot of us would argue that we have a new form of money on our hands, and it's probably the best form of money that the world may have ever seen. And in that context, with that realization, it's difficult to value more other projects because they might do something more efficiently or better or quicker or cheaper, because you're really not comparing apples to apples, right?
Yeah, and I think there's this like tendency, particularly in some of the the tech community in Silicon Valley and the academic community, that want to have this like fancy, all the new bells and whistles, all the latest advancements in all these different things like baked into every single currency and every single protocol. But that's not the way money works. You want money to be simple. You want it to be universal. You want it to be as kind of widely. You want to have the strongest network effects possible. And so I think that's what. I think that's what I kind of missed as I was getting into it. But the more I learned, the more I was like, hey, this is what is really going to make the most sense. Is something that has that ability to just be simple, be fairly elegant, and just work for the most number of people in the most number of situations with the most number of hardware setups in a very kind of straightforward way.
Yeah. So what's your focus these days? I noticed. Are you working with Casa in some capacity now?
Yep. Yeah. So I work on the business team at Casa. I love my job. I basically get to spend my time working with Bitcoiners, trying to help them understand the value of the multi-sig setup that we're bringing to bear. The importance of really thinking about how you are your threat model, the different potential risks to your private keys, and how to protect those. And it's an incredible opportunity. And then I get to take the lessons learned from that and bring it back over to the technical side and talk to those guys about like, hey, how do we build this, make this thing better? How do we make this more scalable? Casa is all about usability. And I think that if we are able to solve usable private key management using multisig and make that super scalable, I think that, Bitcoin, what we can do with Bitcoin is incredible, but there's an entire other world of stuff that we can kind of build on top of it if we solve that fundamental problem.
Right. So what, when you're speaking with people in that capacity at Casa, like potential customers and users, et cetera, what is kind of the pitch that you give them about the product that Casa provides, the product and service?
Yeah, the pitch is, it's not about trusting us. It's about trusting yourself. It's about understanding that we've designed this set of tools and set of services, and it's about educating them and how to use it best, how to understand all the different pieces and how they work together. But ultimately about taking, that kind of standard toolkit that we've developed and then using it and applying it to their situation to make the most, sovereign and secure setup that's possible. And that's gonna be different for everybody, but it's we have this idea called the 90 days of trust when you come on as a new 3 to 5 client. And that's not about 90 days to trust us. It's about 90 days to trust yourself and understand. And we ask, there are a few things where we'll ask people to, to kind of trust us as we get going. but then understand those the reasons why we say things like we have this seedless setup. And I think that once that kind of clicks in people's minds and they're able to kind of go through the process of seeing what it looks like, I think it's really valuable. And they see not only, hey, this is great for me, but also they can see what I can see, which is how this can really scale well beyond anything that we're kind of currently working with.
Right. And what kind of, like, is there a typical client that you're usually speaking to, or is it very broad?
It really runs the gamut in terms of, we have clients all around the world, all different ages. I wouldn't say there's like a typical client. I would say that, for the most part, it's people that really value their sovereignty. And we talk to people that run from hardcore Bitcoiners who have been in this forever and are just saying like, look, I don't want to spend 8 hours a quarter on my security setup and making sure that it's good. I want to kind of outsource that to you. And we also have, very kind of new people to the industry, people who came into it through libertarian circles, through the hard money side, who don't have that technical background. And that's the client that I feel like we're really designing for right now, is people who don't have all the history in Bitcoin. And we want to really make this a usable and secure way for them to hold their coins that doesn't, so they don't just go to Coinbase. They don't just go to a giant custodian and potentially run some of the risks that, those of us who've been in the industry have faced.
Yeah. And how did that come about, you getting hooked up with Casa?
So it was really fortuitous, actually. I was really interested in working with some people that I know in terms of just securing their assets and doing a better job with it. And I was trying to figure out, like, how can I make a business out of this? How can I, maybe do some consulting, help people set up their, help people set up and self-custody in a secure way. And it occurred to me that I'd probably just be selling them Casa and then kind of helping them set it up. And at the time, it turned out that they were hiring for, a role on the business side that would be involved in sales and business development and also some of this client work. And so I decided that, that would potentially be a great fit for kind of what I was interested in.
And you reached out to them and said,
yeah,
I want to be part of the
I reached
team.
out to them. I had I reached out. I think I'd met Jeremy briefly, I think at a conference in the past, so knew him through that. And I'd also met Carolyn as well, just kind of in and around the New York area. And of course, everyone knows about Jameson, but yeah, just happened to reach out. We actually didn't realize this until after I was hired, but one of the guys I work most closely with and I went to middle school together.
Funny.
It took us a little while. Yeah, it took us a while to kind of get that. But
and how big is the team? Like, how many people do they have, like in a position like yours?
In a position like mine, it's a fairly tight team. Our business side is it's definitely a small portion of the company. Overall, we're about in the mid-20s now.
Right. Yeah, Casa was one of those companies. There's many different reasons to be bullish for Bitcoin, right? Whether you look at the price or the type of people in the space, on Bitcoin Twitter, and the way that they're speaking and engaging, the quality of the people, for lack of a better term, and then the ecosystem and the products and services that are coming online. And for me, like, I guess last year sometime, seeing a company like Casa really kind of emerge and seeing their commitment to, privacy and to really helping people like engage in this ecosystem in the proper way was another one of those things that just kind of like, makes you more bullish on the space, like seeing that this is the type of companies that this ecosystem is kind of conjuring up.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was an opportunity that just kind of it almost felt like it just fell from the sky for me. It came out of nowhere, and I was just, it hit me at the right time in the right place. One of the things I've always kind of felt about Bitcoin in general is coming from the finance background. There's all this, hedge funds, venture capital firms have this model where they charge you 2% of your annual, funds that you have with that fund. They're just going to take that right off the top. And then any profits that they make by trading your money, they're going to charge 20% of that. It's called the 2 and 20 model. And that just makes no sense in this asset class. This makes no sense in this industry, because like the best trade is to buy Bitcoin and just hold it.
Yeah.
And so like it seemed really hard for me to justify. A lot of people going out there starting token hedge funds. I was kind of in that world at the time, but it would just seem really hard to justify that kind of business model in this kind of asset class. So, I was like, how can I think about like a problem that needs to be solved that I can, that I can work with. And, self custody was like the thing that really kind of came out for me. It's not about, investing this stuff the right way from a financial perspective. It's about investing in this stuff the right way from a security and self sovereignty perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. The custody thing is such a, it's one of those things in the space that a lot of companies, I feel like, are trying to rationalize basically by saying not everybody is going to want to to have self custody over their coins. It gets brought up at conferences and talks and stuff like, and all these solutions are being drummed up, for other people to be the custodians of your coins, and then we're back into one of the primary problems of the legacy system is that now there's trust involved. Now there's a third party involved. What do you make of kind of some companies in the ecosystem or organizations or people trying to or offering services that kind of bring back that element of the previous system? Do you think it's good like that because some people are going to want it, or do you think we should be focusing on making custody easier rather than offering solutions that don't require it?
I think that some people are going to want it. I think that some people are going to want some of these financial products, and I think some people are going to learn the hard way, the same lessons that we learn over and over and over again. That's just the way humans operate, and we can't really say no, you can't do that. We shouldn't that to me goes down a different road that I don't like. But the fundamental question of whether or not you have Bitcoin is, can you pull up a wallet, download a wallet on your phone, on your, on your desktop, whatever it is, can you send funds from whatever that third party custodian, lending, ETF, whatever it happens to be, can you send funds from that wallet to a wallet that you own, that you can pick up and walk away with? If you can, as long as you can do that, it's Bitcoin. The minute you're not able to do that, you don't have Bitcoin. You have an IOU. So I love what Trace Mayer is doing around proof of keys. I think it is one of the single most important things for us as Bitcoiners to really push. And yeah, so that's, people are going to do what they're going to do. The markets are going to do what the markets are going to do. As long as we hold strong to that piece of the ethos, I think that people will learn their lessons.
Yeah. What has been the influence of your military background in your approach to Bitcoin, if it's at all unique from maybe someone who doesn't have that background? But you were a surface warfare officer, right? Is that correct?
Yep.
So
yeah. So
what does that mean, and then what's the influence on Bitcoin?
Sure thing. That's the fancy term that we had to come up with when we got submariners and aviators. Used to be a Navy officer was just a guy on a ship. Surface warfare officer is a ship driver. It's the pipeline junior officers who are training to move up the ranks and become the captain of a ship someday, and then on to big fancy admiral jobs doing what have you. But yeah, you're really you learn the ship, you fight the ship, you drive the ship, you're a navigator, you are an engineer, and it was in a lot of ways like an incredibly powerful thing for me to kind of prepare me for Bitcoin. We talk about the surface fleet as the kind of the security layer for global capitalism. Capitalism depends on trade, it depends on international commerce, and there tends to be whatever the dominant naval power is in the world tends to be the one that kind of gets to set the rules. You can see this, the Spanish in the age of exploration, they had the strongest navy and they kind of dominated that era. The British in the colonial period had the strongest navy, and the sun never set on the British Empire, and they really kind of dominated the economic paradigm for that period. Post World War II, it's been America. It's been American style capitalism. That the joke that I made, I think, in my piece was that McDonald's follows in the wake of carrier battle groups everywhere you go. I would see America in every single port that we pulled into overseas. So once you kind of have that perspective that the security layer really determines a lot about how commerce actually operates. Once I kind of applied that to cryptography and some of these things that's happening in the Bitcoin space, you can really start to see the parallels how like this security model is really the most important thing when it comes to when it comes to kind of how commerce operates, and then ultimately kind of where the power is in the system.
Right. And so what do you make of Bitcoin's security model as a kind of military-minded, military experienced person?
It's interesting to me because there's two sides of it. There's first of all the economic side and the incentives with the miners and the distributed consensus. I'm not nearly enough of an economist or computer scientist to like totally understand that piece of it. The part that I really get is that we're applying, asymmetric cryptography here, and that just means that it is so much cheaper to defend something than it is to attack something. The NSA can spend all their money for millions and millions of years and not be able to, break a single public-private key address through brute force.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean they can't get to you in other ways, but they're going to have to spend a lot more resources to attack anything than they're going to have to spend to defend it. And once you can then kind of scale up the number of people that have that kind of access to that technology that allows that that kind of differential leverage. I feel like I'm getting really abstract here, but
No.
once you can kind of have more people that have access to asymmetric cryptography, it really shifts the dynamic of power, and it shifts it away from large centralized institutions, and it shifts it towards the individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I spoke with Eric Voskuil about many things, and this being one of them. And his take on part of this is that a lot of times people he echoed, I think, what you just referenced, but he also says when people think that the government is there's too much bureaucratic bloat, or it's too slow, or it's not organized enough to ever attack this if they ever wanted to. He's basically on the other side saying, no, they're extremely rational actors, and if a time comes when it's worthwhile for them to try to stop something like this, then they would definitely have the organizational and resource capacity to do so. Based on your experience in the military, what's your take on the government's ability, should they wish to stifle something like Bitcoin?
I think it's pretty fragile. I
Bitcoin's
tend to
pretty
be fairly
fragile.
optimistic. No, I actually think that the government's
Government.
position is a lot
Okay.
more fragile than people who haven't been on the inside appreciate. The state's incredibly powerful, but it is only, from a military perspective, it's only as powerful as it is kind of able to wield that power. That's tautological, but you think about on the ground, you have a grunt who's told to go and do this, that, or the other. You have someone who joins the military for whatever reasons they have, and they're told to go fight this person, shoot this person, what have you. We used to live in an era where there was so much more control over the source of information that grunt was getting. And we don't live in that era anymore. Anything, any like mission that the military is setting you on, any ideas that they're trying to kind of indoctrinate into people have to go through the filter of their Instagram feed, have to go through the filter of all these other potential ways that you can communicate to them. And that just means that it gets a lot harder for the government to take these actions that would be seen as extremely detrimental, or, just counter to liberty, what have you. There's certainly selection that like people that go into the military already have some bias towards believing that the people in charge are right. But something that, you've learned a lot as an officer is that you never want to give an order that's contradicted, because then, where do you go from there? So it's not necessarily all about giving the right orders. It's about making sure that you're giving orders that people are going to follow. And I think that it gets harder and harder to give, to potentially just say, hey, we're going to like go full totalitarian and shut it down because we said so, because you have to have the foot soldiers who will actually kind of carry out those actions and go and do whatever it takes to make that happen. And I just think that the government's ability to kind of control the actual, the people at the pointy end of the spear is significantly reduced for a lot of different reasons.
Right. And did your time, in the military, because Bitcoin is seen as this kind of anti-state sort of entity. Well, first of all, do you agree with that? And secondly, did your time in the military as kind of the tip of the spear of state power influence your thinking about something like Bitcoin that seeks to take power away from the state?
It certainly did. I think that there's a lot of power. I think that there's potential for a lot of abuse of power. I tend to be as an American, I'm very much of the mind that like at its best, like Bitcoin could definitely just end up being a check on the power of central banks. And that would be plenty. That is many 10x, 100x or more from where it is today. And it's also, it also means that it just significantly improves the decision making of governments around the world. I think that's a better outcome. At the same time, I also think that I think that that's the future that I'm probably hoping for, because that's a much more peaceful transition to get there, and maybe people don't totally notice. I don't think that or I guess it's probably possible that normal people don't totally notice that transition if that's what happens. And yeah, I certainly think that my time in the military, like, it gave me a lot of respect for state power in certain ways, and then gave me a lot of kind of questions and hesitancies about it in other ways. Just seeing ways that it's abused, and macro ways and in micro ways, and no one ever feels like they're abusing it, but you definitely see a lot of places where bad things happen because of bad incentives.
Right. And so when you left, was it kind of a relief that you didn't have to engage in a system that, had those negative, those drawbacks that you just articulated, or what was the feeling when you left?
Oh yeah, I was very happy to get out. I felt like my community in particular, if you remember, about 2 summers ago, there were like 2 collisions with U.S. Navy ships. I think they were both in Asia. Really bad. A bunch of people died. It was just awful. And when I saw that happen, people asked me, "Oh my God, do you think they were hacked? Like, what happened? What's going on? How could this happen?" I was like, I am not surprised, because I saw from the ground level, like, how all the incentives in the part of the military that I was in were pushing people to work insane hours, super understaffed crews. And I'm frankly shocked that it took as long as it did to have like 2 tragedies like that. And the reason for that is just all the money is going into new programs. It's going into places where, it's going into places that will, make money for defense contractors, and, basically put a feather in the cap of admirals and politicians. And it's not going into the places like maintenance and staff, the boring parts of running military that need it. So when you see that the people in charge are kind of treating lives of sailors that I worked with, and, people that I cared about, like, with that much kind of casual, oh, whatever, it'll be fine, just make them work longer hours, with worse gear, it really kind of, that, I think, more than anything else, was what really kind of pushed me towards towards my libertarian views, that, like, there's just a bunch of broken incentives in the system right now.
Right. And when did you leave?
2012.
And so when Trump says he revamped the military, it was dilapidated, and he polished it up and put a bunch of money into it, would that have ameliorated the issue that you were just talking about, or is all that money going into, the flashy stuff that you just referenced, or do you even know?
It's all going into the flashy stuff, as far as I can tell. I mean, I don't have specifics. I think now, after these tragedies in the surface fleet, I'm sure, and I certainly hope, that they've put in a bunch more, put some more resources over in that direction. But that wasn't the only place it happened. I had a classmate of mine from the Naval Academy was killed in a helicopter crash that was basically caused by poor maintenance and the lack of the spare parts that his squadron needed to repair it. They had to get the hours in for training, and he went out and he went flying, and he crashed in the Atlantic. And you see this thing all over the place. Those are just the 2 kind of examples that I'm the closest to. But all the incentives are to push towards flashy systems. All the incentives are to do the thing that's politically expedient, not the thing that actually is needed. And it's nothing new. I mean, there's world famous generals who would talk about this from years going past. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower, military industrial complex. Smedley Butler was a Marine general who had a lot, had a lot to say around this. I don't think that like spending more money on the military is a solution. I think that in America, I think we need to be honest and realistic about like what we actually want the military to be doing, because right now, I don't think that there's a lot of kind of political process around that.
Right. And what do you make of the current geopolitical dynamic as a military vet? Pretty much mostly vis-a-vis China and all the stuff that gets talked about today.
The China stuff is interesting. I don't have a super strong view there. I basically, I was never a big tariff guy or excited about Trump's trade policies, but then you see what China's doing and the way they're kind of controlling speech in the U.S. The NBA, Blizzard Entertainment, Apple, all the Hollywood studios. That definitely gives me pause. The other thing is that, at the same time, I look at like what is going on in the Middle East right now and all this like frustration with pulling out of Syria. And I feel awful for our allies and what we're doing to them. But, how do you get out of these wars that we should never be committed to in the first place? Seems like figuring that out should be the number one priority of America and of America's political establishment. But, everyone just wants to keep fighting because of reasons, and it doesn't quite go, can never quite get out of it. There's always a reason to stay. And so that's definitely been.
And you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. I mean, I remember it wasn't that long ago where, the Republicans were the warmongering party and the Democrats were saying, let's not start these wars, let's not be in these wars. And then when, your opponent is the one calling the shots, whatever he says, it seems like you just automatically have to think the opposite.
Yeah, and I think politics these days for me, I try to keep it as entertainment because that's the best thing that it does. And honestly, building Bitcoin and building things here to me matters to, all the objectives that people actually talk about in politics a lot more. And it's going to be a lot more impactful than engaging in that. But it's fun to do on Twitter sometimes.
Yeah. My sentiments exactly. But let's break into that because, I tweet about that all the time and talk about it on the podcast, in that, if all of these, people that were protesting around the world for a variety of causes understood the degree to which the monetary standard that they were using influenced, if not directly created, a lot of the issues that they're protesting against, then perhaps they would, as you just mentioned, work towards understanding, building, developing that solution so that it could, blossom and just kind of, as it develops and grows and influences more people, actually fixes a lot of the stuff that people are protesting against. So, like, is that what you mean when you say that? Like, a lot of the problems that people rail against today, if we just had a sounder money that we were operating with, would fix a lot of that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a little bit deeper than that. I think it certainly would solve a lot of the problems that we have, but I think that we also are just living in an era where things are fairly good, but people are really unhappy. And I think a lot of that's kind of driven by consumer culture and by like the fact that things are just fairly, that the world is kind of, everyone has too much and everyone is kind of unhappy with it. And I think that, we've lost a lot of our kind of ability to focus on big picture things that matter. And I think that Bitcoin is a big picture thing that matters. I also think that with hard money, you are probably going to be able to get away from a lot of the things that are causing these issues. It's, it's certainly going to be a tough sell, selling the environmental, transforming our energy infrastructure away from what it is and to what it potentially could be. That is a tough sell to the environmentalists who are just going to look at the bottom line and say what happens, when every other coal plant is fired up to run ASICs. I think that it's a tough sell for the for the socialist crowd. That's definitely growing. That like this is a hard, unseizable, decentralized distributed asset. There's certainly some potential for overlap there and to bring some people over, but I do think that those two are particularly are going to be a particularly hard sell for for the Bitcoin community.
What do you think? You mentioned you think it's deeper than that, and you described that a bit. What do you think is the cause of that? Just general dissatisfaction, inability to see the big picture. Like, do you attribute, other than, like, let's say the type of money that globally society uses, what other contributing factors do you see?
That's a good question. I think that, and I say this as someone who's never had like formal religion whatsoever. I was raised outside the church and all that. I do think that I think there's a lack of kind of belief in anything right now. I think that for a long time, the state kind of took over for the role of religion. I think a lot of that had to do with the some of the technology changes at the beginning of the 20th century, where you could actually like see and hear your politicians like face to face. And I think that really kind of, I think that kind of stripped away some of the mystery. And I think that people have just like, for a long time, people kind of believed in politicians they could hear and see and all that and feel. But then you kind of realize how ugly everything is under the surface. And it's true across the board in all these different giant institutions. And I think that, people kind of need to return. I think there's going to be like a return to some really kind of core, fundamental, deeper values. I think Bitcoin is just a piece of that, a return to sound money. And I think that there's going to be, I do think people are probably going to go back to religion. I think that there's going to be a return to kind of focus on smaller communities, like smaller, whether it's your family, your town, I think people are going to kind of return to focus on what's closest and most impactful in their lives, and hopefully less on the global questions, these global problems that at the end of the day only impact you through this little screen that you interact with the rest of the world with.
Right. And do you think Bitcoin will be the catalyst for that? Because, obviously a lot is made of the fact that when people start interacting with Bitcoin, they notice that their thinking and their behavior slowly starts to change as well, whether it be in the realm of diet, whether it be in the realm of relationships, whether it be in the realm of, any, sort of taking responsibility in your life. It begins to change, and you begin to maybe see things differently and be more curious or question things more. So do you think Bitcoin will be the catalyst for that, or do you just see it as something that there's other factors for as well?
No, I think that Bitcoin is totally going to be the catalyst for that. And I think that the reason is that for most people, they shouldn't have to think about their money. They shouldn't have to think about investing in the stock market and like what inflation is going to do or what the government's going to do, or like, and it's everything from like, what do my pension benefits look like? What are inflation rates going to be? What happens if the Fed does this? What happens if taxes change like this? I think that if you don't have to focus that much on money, it's just like, okay, when I'm young and healthy, I can work and I can save. And then when I'm old and retired, I can draw on that money, that wealth that I've accumulated, that I've saved for myself, and potentially then pass them on to my children. Like, it just totally changes your level of, how much you have to focus on. It really frees up, I think, a lot of just energy across society for people to do other things with. And I think that's going to be true in nearly every single area of life. So I would say that's like my hope is that Bitcoin does that, but I actually think that it's going to allow money to be much less important in everyone's life than it kind of is right now.
Yeah, I like that, and I hope that as well. Because sometimes I think that the current money system that we have, if you just turn on your average financial news show, right? Like every commentator, every segment, you've got the ticker rolling at the bottom about what the S&P is doing and what, the NASDAQ and stock markets around the world are doing. And it's like we have this like crazy obsession anxiety with like, oh, things moved 1%, in the green today, or things are 1% in the red today. And like, what does it mean? What does it mean? Who lost? Who won? And it's like every day we're just like walking on this tightrope of like, what is this big, huge financial tornado doing? And how is it affecting us? And I'm sure there will be, well, I'm not sure, but I suspect, a financial industry will still exist in a let's say a hyper Bitcoinized world. But to your point, like I'm hoping that it's far, there's far less emphasis placed on it, and people can pursue other areas of meaning and fulfillment and work, rather than not only so many people being employed by this massive kind of perversion of money and finance, but also with less emphasis placed on less mental energy devoted to it, because people just trust trust the wrong word, but they have confidence in it because they know it's secure, they know it's under their control, and beyond that maybe they don't need to worry about it too much.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I think that if you're spending your money and you are, or let's say you're an investor and you need to invest to outperform Bitcoin. If you live in a world where you have a Bitcoin standard or a very like solid viable Bitcoin as an investable asset, any investment you're going to make is going to have to outperform Bitcoin. So that just totally changes the ballgame in terms of what kinds of projects people go after. It's not going to be, oh, what's the next best way I can like have I can like put a vending machine that's like, it's like Uber but for vending machines or something like that. It's like, how do we tackle these giant problems that are actually going to require, they're actually going to require like long-term planning, long-term thinking, long-term focus. And I think that's like, I just think there's so much money to make a quick buck these days because of how fast the money moves, because of how how much liquidity is just continuously injected into the system. And I think it just encourages us to think small a lot of the times. And like that's one of the things I love about Bitcoin is like I felt like it was like the first like really big idea to come out of tech since probably since like social media, which was the biggest. And I think there's like I definitely think there's a lot of value coming out of tech, but like this is by far the biggest thing in a really long time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was going to ask something in my mind, but yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that, and I think that uh, this once you kind of get that right, once you see the gravity of this change, it's really hard not to be sucked in by it, right? And
Oh, totally.
this is kind of the point that I was making earlier, but I guess I'll ask you what in any if at all, how have you changed, since you've really got sucked in by Bitcoin? Like has I mean, as a military man, I suspect you might have been, disciplined and stuff like that before, but has it changed changed you in any ways?
I actually was never the most disciplined military guy. The secret of me getting into the military was I grew up as a hippie kid in Berkeley, and it was like the only way I could rebel against my parents was to join the military. But no, I would say like Bitcoin is two things, and it's brought me back to, I think I would say like it definitely has like encouraged me to just be a better person, to be stronger, to take my health more seriously, just take a lot of different aspects of my life,
Isn't
live with
that
a bit
crazy
more intention.
that this
It's
fucking
Yeah,
like this internet protocol is making people say that it's caused them to become a better person? Like that's nuts. It's
totally.
hard to wrap my head around that. I agree.
Yeah, but
I'm not the same, but
totally. I guess the other part of that is like, I think there's like a movement towards that in like some different areas of the internet and whatever. But I think that the thing that Bitcoin has going for it that I don't think anything else in the world has right now is it is so optimistic. I don't know if can I swear on your podcast?
absolutely.
Okay, it is so fucking optimistic. It is just like this beacon of hope and like, and it's actually I think one of the most compelling things about Bitcoin is that like stepping away from all the Twitter drama and what have you, which I also love for other reasons, but like
Agreed.
it's just so optimistic about like where we can go with the future, and I think that's really missing in a lot of kind of these movements right now, like digital in real life. And I think back to like when I was a kid growing up in the '90s and like being into tech and like being on the internet. I was like really excited about all the different possibilities of it. Then for me, you kind of fast forward through this decade. 4 years in undergrad, I went to service academy, so I was basically in the military for 4 years of college plus 5 years active duty. I get out in 2012 and like I'm excited to go back to tech, and tech then is Google and it's Facebook and it's just these giant corporations that feel like they're creeping into every aspect of our life. And it's also just kind of boring and bureaucratic and just like not, it's not fun. It wasn't kind of counterculture. It wasn't like exciting the way the internet was exciting in the 90s. And so, you know, seeing Bitcoin was the first time that I kind of caught that energy again, caught that like excitement that I had as a kid about like, wow, what are the possibilities? What can we build with this? So yeah, I would say the discipline and like the sense of purpose I had in the military, plus like the wild excitement and optimism about the future from like I think the internet in the 90s are the two things that it brings together for me.
Yeah, and I think the term beacon of hope is, so apt. And look, like, I mean, I do talk about it a lot, but it's so consistent that people see it this way, and that's why, I was speaking with Haas McCook, and he was like, we I think he was referring to the Little Bitcoin book, but he was saying, if your average social justice warrior, if they would read that book, they'd turn into an economic justice warrior overnight. And I think, I wanted to talk to you a bit about, just from your perspective, about the kind of socialist, movement that's going on today. But I think you hit the nail on the head with saying that, like, there's a lot of hopelessness and things like that, and that for the people that end up coming to Bitcoin, it does provide that kind of beacon of hope that draws them forward, changes their perspective, makes them realize that if you try to refine yourself and, really try to draw the best out of yourself, there's a reward at the end, or there's a good cause worthy of your effort that's pulling people forward, and that is Bitcoin. And I know it sounds crazy. I have friends that aren't really into Bitcoin, and they tell me all the time that Bitcoin seems like a cult and a religion and stuff. And I kind of laugh, and I'm like, well, I mean, in some ways it is, because it's people are so drawn into this thing. They're so hopeful about the change that the potential change that it could have on things, and it caused them to change their lives in order to get the most out of themselves and out of this system, this protocol, this network. So, in some ways, as crazy as it sounds, but there are a lot of overlap, between this
Oh
and
yeah.
a religion.
Well, and I don't think it's that crazy to
Well,
say.
we don't think so,
There's
but
so much, but there's so much like religious imagery in all of our money. There's always been this idea that religion and money are kind of tied to each other because, ultimately, what's money? Money is just this kind of shared illusion of like things that we find value in, and there's obviously many properties that go into that and make that something sustainable and durable over the long run and all that. But like, in the day to day, it's just that you and I believe that this thing has value, and that allows us to transact with each other. So I don't think that like the religion thing, and I get that that's like supposedly a knock on Bitcoin, but it's like, no, all money is religion. You are the ones who don't realize that like that this is that money is religion at its fundamental level.
right.
I did want to go back just to the socialist thing. I do think that the other piece that we should try to, because I think there's probably a lot of socialists out there who want something and want something bigger, and that selling them on this can be it's certainly like something that we can do. And one of the hooks might be also like, look, all those people out there, like a lot of the reason for the evil that you see in the world, that's not not made up. I mean, your solutions are wrong, but what you are identifying is 100% accurate. But the reason for that is the fiat money system, and we are working actively to undermine that.
Exactly.
I think that's going to be another, having the right narratives and the right memes around, around how Bitcoin is tackling that problem head on. I think is going to be important for bringing more people over.
Yeah, I totally agree. But it is the leaders of this movement, whether it's Sanders, AOC, whomever, like they'll be the last people to start talking about sound money, because their whole platform is predicated on having this big honeypot that they can use to satisfy their constituents and their supporters, and pay for everything, cancel student debt, pay for
Oh, sure.
this and that. So like they'll be the last people to talk about the money, right? Even though they're
Yeah,
also the most vocally opposed to a lot of the problems that the existing monetary system has bubbled up. I mean, I just think there's a disconnect there.
Yeah, I mean, they just want to take that power for themselves. And I think that the fundamental thing for me, the difference is that, and I see a lot of where like politics is going and where we're going is like these much smaller communities and stuff mattering like in smaller groups, and really the freedom to exit. I think that that's like what Bitcoin really allows is you can walk across any border in the world with your net worth on a piece of paper, or or a couple hardware devices in a multi-sig setup, like whatever it is, you can, your money is portable, your wealth is portable, and I think that that is really going to change the dynamic. And my view personally is like, look, if there are places that want to go full socialism, and like, New York City wants to become a total 100% socialist economy and run themselves like that, I think they should do that. Like, that is the people who live there deciding what kind of system they want to live under. Now, the one caveat to that is you have to be able to exit, and Bitcoin is kind of that freedom to exit. I think as long as you have that, as long as people are able to leave those kinds of situations, then let the socialists have socialism, and we'll go somewhere else, and the cards will fall where they may. I think that I have opinions about how they're going to fall and what's going to happen, but yeah, I think that that's like ultimately freedom is about letting other people be free too. And look, so if your socialism is your thing, go ahead, give it a shot. So we'll see what happens.
Right. Yeah, I've seen from some of your Twitter output that you're not a supporter. You're not an advocate. You wrote a couple. I read some of the blog posts that you put out there, and one of them was a letter to Brad Sherman, right?
Yep.
Right. So he's a congressman. Is that right?
Yeah. So he's a congressman. He's a loudmouth who makes a lot of hay hating on Bitcoin.
Right, and he was basically saying that we should ban. I mean, what did he say? He stumbled, right? He said like we should ban ownership, but then I think he walked that back a bit and said something else. And was he not the one that basically overtly stated more clearly perhaps than anybody previously in recent times about how the U.S. dollar was basically the mechanism or the focal point of U.S. geopolitical power, and we have to be very, very careful of anything that seeks to compete with that or take it away.
Yeah, and I think that he's not wrong about that. At the same time, I think that like that ship is already sailing. Like, we are already losing that power. I think that America doesn't really want it. The flip side of us having like the strongest, this like most powerful currency is, it's sure, it means we can buy cheap stuff. It also means that like it's hard to get a job in America, and like this is just politics kind of playing out. Also, like, the Europeans don't want us to have this much power. Obviously the Russians and the Chinese don't want us to have this much power, and it's going to be competitive. And I think that paradoxically, if we want to maintain like the maximum amount of power, I think that the U.S. should support Bitcoin. I don't know if it'd be, if our Federal Reserve decided to go on the Bitcoin standard tomorrow, I would be thrilled. But realistically, I think that what they need to do is like have a good regulatory environment that encourages innovation. And ultimately, the reason is this: like, Bitcoin is speech, code of speech. Bitcoin is people using the First Amendment to, provide the protections of the Second Amendment, Third Amendment, and the Fourth Amendment to anyone who can download and run it, run a full node and do some transactions. Like, it is a fundamentally like, I think it is serving the purpose that a lot of the Constitution was kind of set out to do. And I think it is fundamentally like, and I'm an American saying this obviously, and as someone who's served the country, like, I believe in the ideas, but I think that it is at its core a very American idea. And I think that, like, if we're short-sighted and we say like, oh, look, this is going to like undercut America's power in the world, it's like, yeah, it's going to certainly, like, a Bitcoin standard world is one where America has less power than it does right now, but it's also one where all of our adversaries have none. I mean, that's the thing with, that's the thing with the, sorry, I just got a little distracted. Yeah, that's the thing with our system of government, and it's obviously has a lot of issues right now, but it's it's kind of resilient. It's much more resilient, I think, than a totalitarian state is. Like, Bitcoin might bend, liberal democracies. It will break totalitarian regimes. And if you are a totalitarian, the more totalitarian a state is, like, the more Bitcoin is a threat to it. So, yes, maybe it'll undercut America's power a little bit, but it's going to do a hell of a lot more to all of our adversaries out there. And the only places where it's going to hurt us is where we are being a little authoritarian ourselves.
Right.
So,
right. Did you actually send the letter? Was that like a real letter that you sent to Brad Sherman?
yeah, I sent it. I never got a response, but
Sure.
whatever.
And what do you think of concentration of mining in China? You make the point that this is much more of a threat. The more authoritarian a regime or a country is, the more of a threat something like Bitcoin is. What's your take on mining concentration in China, and to what degree that conveys influence over the network to the Chinese government ultimately, and the production of the hardware?
Yeah, I think the production of the hardware is potentially a more important one. Ultimately, I don't really worry about it all that much. There's some crazy doomsday scenarios where bad stuff happens, but I think that the network figures it out. The network works and ultimately kind of gets away from it. And I also just I haven't read up on like mining centralization and all the research recently. My understanding is that it is becoming a lot less. It's kind of moving back the other direction, becoming more decentralized now. I could be wrong about that, but that's my general take. And ultimately, like, there's the question, like, what matters more to you? Do you, it's about the individual person, the individual decision maker. Do you want to shut down all of the mining in your country because you don't like this and it's going to take down your government? Or do you say, hey, maybe I could like use this to my advantage and, not shut it down, but like try to like get some coin out of it or like be a part of the system. I think there's always going to be stronger incentives at the lowest levels to support the system because that's kind of what it's designed to do.
Right. So it's kind of referring to the game theory of Bitcoin operating on what the individual level and the state level and pretty much any level that interacts with it, right?
Yeah, that's basically the idea. Who knows what'll happen, but I also think that if there was a significant attack or attempt to shut down miners in China, I think that it would certainly be very disruptive and bad for the price. But I think that the network would figure it out over the long run.
Yeah, and is this kind of along the vein of the piece you wrote on Bitcoin as being a weapon? And I think you refer to it maybe as kind of this asymmetric weapon. Comparing it to the AK-47 and just how now, like, a large number of individuals having power versus power like a large amount of power concentrated in the state. Can you elaborate on that one a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So this goes back to like the idea of the kind of like asymmetric cryptography and the fact that it is very cheap to make something that is very hard to defeat at scale.
Right.
So, we all know that, yeah, sure, an army can beat like a single person. But if there's, many of those single people kind of spread out with cheap weapons, it gets harder and harder to do that for a number of different reasons. So yeah, I think of, the second half of the 20th century was really kind of defined by the rise of the AK-47. It really empowered small revolutionary militia type groups everywhere. It's how the Mujahideen defeated the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The Viet Cong defeated the U.S. military in Vietnam. And it's just really, there's just not a lot that as a large power you can do when you're kind of fighting in someone else's territory. When those people have rifles, and at the end of the day, a rifle is going to kill you just as dead as a 20 gun artillery barrage.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of the general idea is that like by putting strong cryptography in the hands of individuals, it just the NSA could defeat anyone's security setup. I don't care how hardcore you are, the NSA will get you. But at the same time, they don't have the resources to go after everyone if everyone applies even like a fairly low level of this stuff. One of my favorite things to say is like the wrench problem doesn't scale. The problem of like, oh, you have a super secure, RSA, encrypted, encrypted drive, and someone's just going to come and hit you over the head with a wrench. Yeah, you're going to give up your password pretty quick. But that doesn't scale in a couple of ways. First of all, you have to pay lots of people to hit lots of people with lots of wrenches, so it doesn't scale economically like that. It also doesn't scale politically. Like the political cost of imposing, of a state imposing its will just gets higher and higher. And this isn't necessarily about Bitcoin, it's about social media for the most part. It's like when we see what the cops are doing in places like Catalonia, in places like Hong Kong, what we see in the U.S. with police shootings, like the political will to like support this really honestly terrible behavior is just getting lower and lower and lower. So you start having secret police or something coming after Bitcoiners in a nightmare scenario. The first time someone's video feed shows someone knocking on the door, getting wrench attacked like that, that is going viral. That is everywhere. That is all over Twitter. How long can the government kind of sustain that level of political backlash when can they sustain it over a long enough time to achieve their goals? And basically on that level, my answer is no. I think it's hard to fight wars if you're a liberal country these days. I think it's hard to go after your civilian population. If you're a totalitarian state, yeah, you have a lot more leverage in that, and that's tough. But that's where I think that Bitcoin's ability to let people exit those situations is critically important.
Yeah, I agree totally. I think it was you. Correct me if I'm wrong. And this might have been a while back, but I think you posted the meme or the picture where I think it was referring to the gun debate, and people were saying, or often quoted statement like, what use is the citizens having gun against like the insane power of the state, right? And then like at the bottom part is a Vietnamese farmer just smiling, right? Like he's wearing his like rice paddy hat and he's just like a big smile. And obviously the takeaways there are like, well, obviously it's happened before. And this is to your comment on kind of the asymmetric distribution of power, right? So even though there's a lot of power concentrated in one place, if a large number of people have a little bit of power, then it can balance the scales and it can resist that imbalance of power dynamic. What is your take on the gun debate these days?
I think I'm a strong Second Amendment supporter, and I think that it's a critically important. I think it's just a critically important thing for people to kind of like take responsibility. And it's not about fighting the government. You never want to be in a situation where you have to fight the government. I mean, that's horrible. Like look at Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Like that is just a bad situation. But at the same time, if you have an armed population, then it just really checks the ability, what the government is even going to try to do.
Right.
It really checks how much power they can even kind of try to take. And I think Bitcoin's very similar in that way. Like if you have a lot of people holding Bitcoin, they're holding it securely and they're not holding it on exchanges. Like, yeah, you can ban it, but again, how do you enforce that? Who do you go after? How do who is the actual cop who has to knock on the door to go and say, hey, give up your Bitcoin? How are you going to handle it when someone says, I don't have any, I lost it, I lost my private keys? Like how you actually kind of implement those steps, I think is a really hard thing to do. So that's like the one side that's like mostly related to Bitcoin. I also think that it's, and this kind of gets lost a lot in kind of the politics of the gun debate today, but I also think that guns and Bitcoin, together are really powerful tools for people that are minorities or people that are in like less advantaged positions to, really have something that they can, call their own. They can use to, protect their rights and protect their community. There's a history to the gun debate where the initial kind of gun bans that came out, I think in the 1970s, they all came out of California. And they came out after the Black Panthers in Oakland, where I grew up. These Black nationalists were openly carrying rifles around. freaked everybody out, and so they passed a bunch of legislation because basically it was a kind of racist response to being afraid of black people with guns. Um, and I think that like that was a attempt by that community to really try to take more control back over their world, back over their lives from like the way that they were being treated by police. And I hope that Bitcoin serves a similar function in places that are that have a lot of authoritarian power, or places where people who are parts of communities that are disenfranchised, they're disadvantaged, can say, look, whatever is happening in the financial system, whatever is happening in the political system that's oppressing, that's working against me, that's working against my community. This is something that doesn't care about the color of your skin. It doesn't care about where you came from. It is just math. It is just value, and you can kind of take advantage of that. And that's kind of my. I guess that's like the two pieces of where that analogy to me kind of really comes together. And also, Bitcoin does have the advantage of a lot less of the kind of negative potential side effects, which are just something that that's the hard side. I won't deny there's like that whole other side to the gun debate that you have to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, I really liked. I mean, well, like anything of great utility and power. I mean, usually it's a double-edged sword, at least in some capacity, right? And I think that is why it's so important that these ideas of responsibility are instilled in us as we grow up and develop. I can't remember how I articulated it before. I'm sure it's been said many times, but like, I feel like in today's society, we're kind of conditioned, taught. We grow up in an environment where being like compassionate to the point of being powerless, not being a formidable force, is actually positioned as a positive. People aren't taught or brought up to be formidable, to be strong, to be able to exert force and impose their will, and then have the responsibility and the maturity not to do it. It seems like most people these days are being brought up to consider their capacity for force as a negative, and to try to squash that or diminish it in some way.
Yeah, that's incredibly well said. I'm glad you put that way. I think that I do think that there's like this push to like to just like kind of, and particularly for men, I think that there's just there's kind of these pressures against kind of engaging in your some of like the baser kind of male instincts for play, for violence, and it was one thing that also kind of appealed to me about joining the military, is I knew I was going to a place where that was that kind of stuff was going to be celebrated. I mean, the number of just like wrestling matches that I would get into, just like fun play fights with my friends.
Right.
In the military, I was like all the time. It was like one of my friends from growing up who I had a kind of relationship with, but not most of them, and definitely not in my after I left the military. Have not had any of that kind of any of that kind of relationship, or like really seen much of that at all, unless I'm with a veteran community or something along those lines.
Yeah, I just think it's super important. I think a lot about like early education, and another tradition that I'm fascinated by is rites of passage, that have existed, throughout time, and nowadays perhaps more so in like indigenous cultures and stuff. But, as such an important kind of delineation between, okay, you're no longer a kid without consequences. Now you're entering into the stage where like, your application of your power and your force and everything you bring to bear has consequences. Let's learn how to both test them to make sure that you have them, and you refine them and you sharpen them, but also know how and when to use them. And that just seems like it's completely lost. And I think in an environment where I think it's way more dangerous that we have a culture full of people that don't realize nor how to use the power they have, versus knowing the power that they have, knowing how to use the power they have, and being instilled and educated on how to use that power responsibly for the benefit of themselves and the community that they're in.
Yeah, we had this idea called is rank hath its privileges and rank hath its responsibilities in the military. So it's like, if you're an officer, there's certain things you get to do. You get to show up and you get to show up and you eat in a nicer place than the enlisted guys do. But it's also has its responsibilities. You are the one who has to, if there's something that needs to get figured out in the middle of the night, guess what? There might be one guy from the team working on it, but the officer is going to be there too. And it's this idea that privilege and power also comes with responsibility at the same time is critically important. And I think that's as I kind of also was like drifting from my from my blockchain to like shitcoinery to like Bitcoin on that progression. One of the things that I really noticed and I felt like was true about the Bitcoin side of it was like they were extremely consistent in ways that were, in some ways abrasive and brash, but like they were, the strongest voice of Bitcoin were extremely consistent about, calling out like, hey, this is bullshit. Like, this is not how you do things. There are a ton of scams here. And I think that, that was like one of the things that has really like kind of fundamentally damaged, the Ethereum thing, which it was like, along with Zcash and Monero and some of these other projects, like maybe interesting alternative assets, but like the amount of just complete nonsense that was kind of tacitly encouraged by that community, I think has really, really set it back in the minds of a lot of people for, probably, we'll see if they're able to recover from it. But I think that kind of like that differentiation, that like kind of focus on, hey, we got this thing. Let's like not fuck it up by going down this rabbit hole of scams, even if it could make some of us fabulously wealthy. I think like that ethos was one of the things that like through the bear market really made me realize like, okay, Bitcoin is where the most, responsible and interesting stuff is happening.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's, whether it's the gun example or the one that you just used, I think we see these manifestations of a lack of the scenario that I was describing in all cases. So, for example, like in Bitcoin, and I'm not insinuating that all Bitcoiners are like, have fully harnessed their power and, only use it for good and can, deploy it whenever it's rational and just and blah, blah, blah. But I think, and because we're just at the beginning of this thing, maybe in 100 years, the Bitcoin, the way that people engage with Bitcoin, or as a result of having a society on sound money, this may be way off base, but I like to think about like your stereotypical sort of ancient kung fu philosopher, right? Like in ancient China, maybe like a Taoist master or something like that. And when I was a kid, I was like, or let's say high school, like I was super fascinated by philosophy and wisdom and this kind of stuff. And you see these like, and whether it's in movies or books or whatever, so whether it's fiction or nonfiction, you see these like really wise like sages. They always say things that like really resonate on a deep level, and they can also kick your fucking ass, right? And I was like, that seems in some level it seems contradictory. Like this peaceful, like never use power, like try to be in harmony with nature, this sort of thing. But they can also kick your ass. And I was like trying to reconcile that in my head. And I do think that kind of dynamic is what we're talking about. And at the time I was like, well, maybe that's why. Like they realize that you can't just be the kind of harmonious, peace-loving person. You have to have the other side of that if you're going to preserve and promote, the harmonious peace side of it, right? And you have to be able to resist a force that's trying to take those things away from you. Otherwise, you have no ability to uphold those things. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, totally. Yeah. The way I like to think about it, we're chimps. We are apes at the base level. We have violent emotional tendencies. And, I think that like our ability to overcome that is really incredible. But fundamentally, the ability to overcome that depends at a very like base level in society on the violent consequences of straying outside of those boundaries. And I think that like having institutions and also just having like individual ability to kind of like to understand how that power operates, I think is fundamentally important. And anytime there's kind of like anytime one group gets kind of too much of that power at the expense of the other groups, it gets abused because we're apes. And everyone kind of needs a check on their power, and everyone needs a check on what they're doing. And I think that to the extent that which we kind of give up that power to institutions that we trust to do it, we do so at our own peril, because institutions that have power tend to attract sociopaths who want to use it for their own purposes, and also sometimes it just creates bad incentives with people on the inside. So
Yeah. And
yeah.
I think what I was trying to articulate there too is just the toxicity, quote unquote, in the Bitcoin community, right? The reason why, which you were referring to a moment ago, I think that's related to what we're discussing, because it's a willingness for people to speak their truth, speak their mind on a given subject. And I think, of course, sometimes it's overdone, sometimes people get carried away with themselves, whatever. But I feel like it's people basically having the confidence to call, like you said, call bullshit when they see it. And I see that as a positive. And I think you need to have a certain degree of confidence and comfort with your formidableness, let's say, to be able to do that kind of stuff. Because if you're just kind of a meek, go along to get along sort of person, you're not going to do that. And that's at the detriment of the community and the thing you're engaging in. Obviously, it can be overdone, right? But if you're not willing to, or capable or confident enough to stand up and be like, no, this is fucking bullshit, then everything suffers. And I hate to kind of shit on the ETH heads, but there's you can see that a bit of meekness in that community in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that so I mean, one of my just all-time favorite Bitcoin articles, Nick Carter's "A Most Peaceful Revolution" was just like, I mean, I read it on the plane and I was just like so pumped up after reading it. But he said like the sin of altcoiners was they lacked the courage of their convictions. Bitcoin is built to be censorship resistant against state power, and that is like the biggest thing that you can go for. And if that's like if that is what you're setting out to do and to try to accomplish, like there are things you have to do. You have to be open source. You have to have small blocks. People have to be able to run their own node. Yeah, maybe not all the time, but like at the base level, it has to operate in a certain way that functions like this. And yeah, I think when he said that their sin wasn't anything other than just that they lacked the full courage of their convictions of like what they were trying to do. And yeah, so that's kind of where I go on that. And I also, for me, like that meekness, it's not, it can be physical. It's great if you, get benefits from that, but like, it's also, it's also in writing, it's also just in your rhetoric and how you present, whatever it is that you do, you just want to do that thing from a place of strength and a place of conviction. And yeah, I think that's the other word for me about that. Like, if I just sum up like Bitcoin 2019 for me, it's like conviction. It's like saying like, look, the things that we are working towards are worthwhile, and the system works and it's strong, and there's ways to improve it and push the ball forward. But yeah, I think that I just like my conviction in the system and in working on Bitcoin is just like, it is for me, it's at an all-time high. Prices, whatever it is, my conviction is at an all-time high, I would say.
I think I agree, and I think a lot of people are probably in the same situation. I don't know exactly why that happened in 2019. Like maybe, price always probably influences, the fact that Bitcoin had a run and everything else kind of shit the bed, maybe that influence some people's conviction, the development of the ecosystem, the cool innovation in the space, all the amazing conversations and personalities that are, smashing ideas together on Bitcoin Twitter. But, I agree. Like, price be damned, man. Everyone I talk to is the same way. Just like, more conviction than ever, basically.
Yeah. Although I do got to throw a plug out there. Still one of my favorite things about Bitcoin is, or my favorite idea is, like, price is the most interesting thing about Bitcoin because it is a measurement of adoption. It's a measurement of how much people value this thing that is created by computers and some crazy math and cryptography and just a human incentivized system. So price matters. Price matters a lot. It might even be the most interesting thing, but yeah, man, I like doing this stuff.
Right. Well, price is a distillation of everything about whatever is being priced, right? It's a distillation of the work going into it. It's distillation of the value being attributed to it. It's literally prices are such a phenomenal thing because it's this one data point that reflects everything, like that expands into a tree about everything about something, which is so that's why it's so amazing. Also, side note, which is why price controls are just totally insane because it distorts, that thing entirely. All right.
Oh man, yeah. We could do a whole thing on that, but yeah.
I know. All right, I'm going to hit you with the rapid fire questions. You can answer as long and short as you want. You can say pass if you don't want to answer. So I'll just break into it. First one.
All right.
What is money?
Money is a bubble that never pops. So there's the two young fish are swimming by. Old fish swims by, going the other direction. Says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" Two young fish keep swimming. One turns to the other. About 30 seconds later, what's water? Anyways, money is water. Money is a bubble that never pops. It's the water we swim in, and Bitcoiners are the ones who've actually started noticing that it's there and that the pump needs cleaning.
All right. I like that. If you had to explain Bitcoin to your grandmother or somebody over 80, what would you say?
That one's tough. I would say magic internet money, which might just confuse them more, but that's probably about as good as it's going to get. I might try the digital gold route, but I think at some point there's some people, especially over 80, you probably just have to say you got to press the I believe button because there's too much of a gap here.
What is the primary reason why Bitcoin is important or interesting to
you? Separating money and state and providing a massive incentive for us to figure out user-friendly private key cryptography.
What does the quote-unquote sovereign individual mean to you?
It means an inversion of the power dynamic. So individuals are going to be the most powerful. Small groups are going to be incredibly powerful. Large organizations are going to see their power massively diffused instead of kind of concentrated through economies of scale.
How long after you first heard of Bitcoin did you start learning more about it, and if you're comfortable saying, purchase it?
It took me a while. I mean, I think I probably heard about Bitcoin very early on. I started to kind of get interested in it again in 2015. I feel like I kind of really went down the rabbit hole in 2016.
What has been your most effective method of educating people about Bitcoin in conversation or more formally? So basically, what do you say to people that you found lands the best?
I struggle with this. I'll go back to the Bitcoin fixes this and number go up. I think that in terms of getting people to adopt, I've definitely gone down the rabbit hole of trying to explain every single thing about the system. And I think that it's a recipe for disaster. I think that simple messaging is the most important thing to do, appeal to people's greed a little bit. But the other side of it is just be consistent. Keep talking about it and say, whether the price is January 2019 or January 2018, just keep talking about it. And I think people will start to kind of realize that you're not joking about this thing.
Right. What movie or song is most related to Bitcoin, in your opinion?
Okay, James Bond, Goldfinger, where they blow up the radiation device in Fort Knox to radiate all the gold, so that the bad guys supply hoard of gold, moons basically.
Favorite movie clip or rant of all time?
you can't handle the truth from a few good men when Jack Nicholson tells Tom Cruise that we live in a world with walls and that men with guns defend those borders. It's about it's about people in polite society not thinking too hard about about the things that really run the world. They're back to the previous one. They're the fish that don't realize they're swimming in water.
Classic rant. Can Bitcoin be stopped? If so, what is Bitcoin's biggest vulnerability? If not, why not?
The biggest vulnerability to Bitcoin is, I think, someone breaking its cryptography. I think that especially if it's broken in a way that it takes a long time for us to recover from that. I think that anything shy of that is probably not too big of a risk because you could do a hard fork if the network absolutely needed to for some critical bug. I do worry a little bit about states. I don't worry about states shutting down Bitcoin. I worry about states shutting me personally out of Bitcoin because I don't particularly feel like moving to whatever the most friendly jurisdiction is, and that will suck for me. But Bitcoin will be fine.
Right. What was your most recent aha or something? The most recent interesting thing you learned about Bitcoin?
Most recent interesting thing I learned about Bitcoin. I just love everything that is going on Lightning right now. I think it's incredibly exciting. I was like reading some of the stuff on watchtowers, what they're doing, and how those work. I feel like I'm getting behind the curve on Bitcoin from where I like to be, just because work's busy.
Yeah. What do you think will be Bitcoin's biggest impact on society or global culture?
I think just shifting time preference. I think that it is going to make people more focused on the things that matter, and less focused, paradoxically, on money and investing and wealth. It's like hopefully that can be like a solved problem, and people can focus on the long term.
When, if ever, do you think the first central bank will start adding Bitcoin to their reserves, and will they exist in 20 years?
I think it's potentially already happening. I think it's going to, I think 5 years. I would take the under on 5 years any day of the week. But yeah, I think central banks will be around in 20 years. Bankers tend to be smart people who understand money, and I think that some of them are going to figure this thing out and are going to want to protect their asses. And and in some form, they'll be probably issuing Bitcoin back currency, and we'll see how long that works. But 20 years is definitely a reasonable time that experiment could still be running.
What's the biggest mistake you've made with Bitcoin?
The biggest mistake I've made with Bitcoin. That's tough. I would say I don't think I've ever made any huge mistakes with Bitcoin. Probably just not buying more earlier or getting, probably waiting to get, around to get into it. I definitely could have. I think definitely could have got involved a lot earlier. Had some time back, back in probably 2013, 2014 in grad school when I could have had the bandwidth to do it, and just wasn't quite there.
Yeah. How do you feel about Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin's creator, being anonymous and the coins that he likely controls?
I think he needs to stay anonymous. I mean, I think he's probably, I think he's probably dead, or is probably not ever going to reveal himself, and I think that is just fine by me.
We touched on this one a bit earlier, but what have you learned about yourself, or how have you changed, if at all, as a result of learning about and interacting with Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I would, and I'll just kind of reiterate what I said earlier, which is like, Bitcoin has like reignited like the wonder and the hope that I had as a kid. And it's also like, and it's also really like brought me back to the sense of purpose that I had when I was in the military.
I fucking love that, man, and feel very similarly. What is your most controversial or contrarian view or opinion, if not on Bitcoin, any subject? Okay.
All right, my most controversial view on Bitcoin or another subject. Again, I'm just going to go back to what I said earlier, which is that I think that there's going to be like a pretty significant return to religion. I say that as not as a religious person at all, but I just think it's something that people are going to be coming back to. I think that I think that Bitcoin is kind of like a beneficiary of a lot of this kind of people kind of forming into groups online, and I think it's going to be one of the few that kind of survives a lot of the nonsense that's in some of those other kind of cult-like movements that are out there.
So when you say people going back to religion, do you mean like a new religion kind of being formed around Bitcoin, or do you think going back to traditional religions?
No, I think people will probably go back to traditional religions. It's possible that some traditional religions will, incorporate pieces of Bitcoin into them. I think that that's actually something that I could definitely see happening. I'm not sure that I'm just not sure it makes sense to have a religion that's based on money and not, and not, yeah. And I think that religion can certainly operate, can certainly, maybe have ideas that could support Bitcoin, but I don't see Bitcoin itself being like a religion. I think that's putting the cart before the horse because, at the end of the day, I think that our kind of like, our base kind of human actualization needs are about more than money. And it'll probably go in the other direction where, they will, obviously religions will use potentially Bitcoin to like hook more people back into them.
I'd love to dig in on that, but we'll save it for another time. Ballpark estimate of Bitcoin's price in 5 years.
um, yeah, no idea. I would say on the conservative side, probably I'd say, yeah, $2 trillion market cap. Yeah, on the more conservative side.
Do you have a morning
That's
routine?
about it. That's about a 10x from here.
Yeah. Do you have a morning routine? If so, what is it?
My morning routine. I do not have a morning routine. Yeah, I mostly survive. My wife wakes up early, and I tend to wake up when she does, and just kind of roll out of bed.
How do you define success?
Just being happy with what you're doing. Be happy with what you're doing in in your work, and being happy with what you're doing in the rest of your life as well.
Most impactful book you've ever read?
Uh, the pleasure of finding things out. So this is a collection of essays by Richard Feynman, who is a scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and it is incredible. It is about science. It is about how we know things, and it's about science at like a very kind of deep level. But it's about how we really know things. He has a whole there's a whole essay on quantum computing, which would be really interesting to Bitcoiners, I'm sure. But more so than that, he just talks about like how hard it is to really know something is true. He talks about all the little things that can go wrong. There's a great essay on the Challenger disaster that I hope every single engineer working on the Bitcoin Core protocol reads that article about Challenger. It is just he is one of the most incredible scientific minds and just really like kind of deep thinkers that I've ever come across.
Challenger being the space shuttle. Is that right?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
space shuttle that blew up.
Right.
Yeah, he was he was pretty old then, but I think he was called in to do the kind of the post mortem on everything that went wrong, and these just tiny little imperfections in the shuttle and in the I think it was in the fuel system that ended up causing the accident.
What's one piece of advice or important action that you could advise myself, people to take that maybe you don't see too many people doing these days? Related to Bitcoin ideally, but if not, anything is okay.
One piece of advice I could should see people doing, I would say you know don't afraid to put yourself out there and try things that are new and different and challenging. And the one specifically that I'll kind of throw out there to challenge people a little bit is try combatives. Whoever you are, if you're in shape, if you like to work out or do anything like that, try a combat sport just for a little while. When I was in college, my first year of undergrad at the Naval Academy, they make everyone take boxing, and it's not about learning to throw a punch. It's not about getting in shape or learning how to hit someone or figuring out how you're gonna do hand to hand combat. It's just about learning the very simple fact of what it feels like to get hit in the face, and that it's not the end of the world, and that feels kind of you feel like you accomplished something after that, and life goes on, and it's incredibly empowering to know that you can take a punch
You're
and
not made of
it
glass.
sucks, but things you move on with life.
I think that's great advice, man, and obviously it's related to the conversation we were having earlier. But yeah, I love that. What is one question you'd like to see added to this list?
Um, that's a good question. Let's see. I would be interested in how many hours of sleep people are getting.
All
So
right.
I think there's a wide range in like what's functional and healthy for different people. I'd be very curious. I am definitely a I need a lot of sleep kind of person. I know there are people that can get it by like 4 or 5 hours, but that's kind of something kind of curious to me.
Last part, word association. So I'll just blurt out a word. You say the first thing that pops into your head. Satoshi
All right,
Nakamoto.
uh, probably Hal.
Government.
Um, Incentives.
Hash rate.
High.
The individual.
The starting point.
Security.
Casa. Come on, you know I had to do that
Ego.
one. Minimize.
Greed.
Okay,
Stacking sats.
keep going.
Fiat currency.
Short-lived.
Guns.
Fun.
Altcoins.
Science experiments.
Pizza.
Pizza. Laszlo.
Huh?
Laszlo. I
So
think that was the name of the
yeah,
Bitcoin
yeah,
pizza
yeah,
guy.
yeah. I just didn't hear it.
Yeah,
Socialism.
actually,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
socialism.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I don't want to dox him, but I ordered I did spend a little bit of Bitcoin ordering something from this random company, and I get an email from Laszlo, the Bitcoin pizza guy. He just works there doing customer support. And I was like, it wasn't even related to Bitcoin whatsoever. I just saw they had the option to pay. I was like, that is so cool. So I don't want to dox him, but yeah,
What
Laszlo, if you're
was
listening,
was he like, dude? Did you not learn my lesson? Don't fucking spend your Bitcoin.
no, it was just like, hey, thanks for paying with Bitcoin. And I looked at the tagline. I was like, are you kidding me? I was like, anyways, I was a little starstruck there.
That's awesome.
Definitely worth the yeah, definitely worth the little bit of money that I spent to get a personal hello from Laszlo.
Sure. Socialism.
Um, Experiment,
Family.
everything,
Trump.
symptom,
Future.
bright,
Libra.
also science experiment,
Gold.
centralized,
And Bitcoin.
the future.
Hector, that's it, man. I'm sure we could go for several more hours, but I know you got to get all that sleep you were just talking about, so I'll let you go.
Yeah, definitely.
Anywhere
Yeah,
you
good talking to you.
anywhere you
What's
want to
that?
direct people, or Twitter or anything like that?
Yeah, twitter.com/Hector Rosekrans. That's me. Keys.casa. Please reach out if you're interested. Always happy to talk more about all our products. But yeah, best security for your coins out there. But yeah,
Awesome, man. Well, look, I look forward to either doing this again in the future or meeting in Meet Space and having a beer and a longer chat. But until then, wish you all the
sounds
best.
good.
Keep up the great work, and we'll talk in the future.
Awesome.
All right, brother. Take care.
Have a good one.
Bye bye.